Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history and its people. I'm your host Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that we welcome back Jacob Norris. Jacob has been a previous guest of the podcast as we talked about Bethlehem, but today we're going to focus on his latest book, The Lives and Deaths of Jubrail Dabdoub, or How the Bethlehemites Discovered America, published by Stanford University Press in 2023. This is the fantastical yet real story of the merchants of Bethlehem, the young men who traveled to every corner of the globe in the 19th century. Probably we saw some of them even today in some of the Christmas markets across the United States. These men set off with suitcases full of crosses and rosaries and returned with news of mysterious lands and strange inventions, clocks, trains, and other devices that befuddled and bewitched the Bethlehemites in equal measure. With newfound wealth, they built shimmering pink mansions that transform the urban structure of Bethlehem. At the center of these extraordinary occurrences is Jubrail Dabdoub. The Lives and Deaths of Jubrail Dabdoub tells the story of Jubrail's encounters, moving from his childhood in rural Bethlehem to voyages across Europe, East Asia, and obviously the Americas, culminating in a recorded miracle. In 1909, Jubrail was brought back from the dead. To tell such a tale is to delve into the realms of the fantastic and the improbable, realms in which the historian rarely treads. Drawing on aspects of magical realism combined with elements of Palestinian folklore, the author, Jacob Norris, evokes the atmosphere of late 19th century Bethlehem. As the book offers an original approach to historical writing, it captures a fantastic story of global encounter and exchange. But before we delve into all of this, Jacob, welcome.
Thank you, Roberto. Very, very good to be here.
Jacob, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and the origins of the book?
So I'm a historian who has been working for many years on, I suppose, the social and cultural history of Palestine within the wider Middle East and North Africa region. I guess I've also come from a background which has strong influences of global history. I did my PhD at Cambridge as part of the World History Group there. So I think I've always been interested in connecting Palestine's history to these broader flows and currents and thinking about Palestine within transnational contexts. In terms of how the book itself came about, I'd spent a lot of time in Bethlehem. I was there when I was researching my PhD, learning Arabic, and made some very good friends there. And the more time I spent in Bethlehem, the more I became aware of this very global set of influences within the town. It seemed like everybody has a cousin, an auntie, a brother, a sister in some far-flung country around the world, mostly actually in Latin America. So I just became very curious about, well, how does this happen? This town, which in many ways is so hemmed in within the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank, surrounded by the Israeli separation wall, checkpoints, so many kind of restrictions on people's everyday movements. And yet at the same time, there's this sense of connectivity on such a global scale. So that really intrigued me. And I just started to look into that, speaking to people, and gradually began to do research on that topic and realized there was this whole history of migration and circulation, with Bethlehem playing a really, really central role in that, beginning in the mid to late 19th century and continuing up until at least the British Mandate years. So that was the origins of the book's research. And from there, I started to delve into specific angles within that, I guess, but really thinking about how Bethlehem built this global set of connections through the circulation of its own residents in the late 19th century.
There's an interesting connection with a previous author that I interviewed, Nadim Bawalsa, author of Transnational Palestine, who personally was sitting, if I remember well, in a funeral in Beijala, and he discovered to have relatives across the ocean in Latin America, exactly mentioning, what you just said about this network, extensive network of relationship, personal and family relationship between Bethlehem and essentially the rest of the world.
No, I would strongly recommend Nadim's book to your listeners. It's called Transnational Palestine. And in a way, Nadim's book and my book are kind of the mirror image of each other. Nadim's book is more focused on Latin America. It looks in particular at Mexico and Chile and Honduras and the kind of political campaigns that Palestinians in those areas waged especially during the Mandate years. And he's arguing very convincingly that we should consider that a crucial part of Palestine's history of resistance to colonial rule. My book is in some ways more focused on Bethlehem itself. So how do those migrations impact and transform the town itself through these very circular movements? And I guess I go back a little bit further than Nadim in terms of the time reach. But I think they speak to each other very closely.
Your first book, Land of Progress, Palestine in the Age of Colonial Development, 1905-1948, was published by Oxford University Press in 2013, and I can say it was a traditional monograph. This book is not the usual academic work. So The Lives and Deaths of Jubrail Dabdoub is slightly different. In fact, it's a work merging together history and fiction. And I was wondering if you can talk about the writing process, its difficulties and successes.
Yeah, it certainly feels like a bit of a step into the unknown for me. It is a departure from my previous historical writing. One way, I suppose, to explain that is through this key moment in the research process for me, which occurred in 2015, when I heard about these two Palestinian women, Miriam Bouarde and Marie Alfonsine, who were being canonized by the Catholic Church in Rome. And they were being celebrated. This was sort of a global news event. And in Palestine itself, Palestinian Christians especially were sort of proudly celebrating this as a moment of national significance. Some people talking about it as Palestine's first kind of official Catholic saints. So I was following this, and in particular, the life of this woman, Marie Alfonsine. Her original sort of given name at birth was Sultane Miriam Ghatas. She was a woman from Jerusalem, but spent a lot of her life in Bethlehem. And I just started to look into her and the miracles that were associated with her life. And there's various kind of online sources about her. And I stumbled across this event from 1909 where we find her bringing back from the dead a guy called Jubrail Dabdoub. And I sort of stopped dead in my tracks. I think I was reading the web pages actually of the Rosary Sisters, which is the congregation that this woman, Marie Alfonsine, established. And it was one of those moments as a historian, where they happen all too rarely, but sort of moment of serendipity where you sort of, there's a wonderful kind of explosion that happens when you realize this is the guy that I've been researching in connection to these Bethlehem migrations, Jubrail Dabdoub. He certainly wasn't the only person. I've been researching many different sort of strands of family history within those Bethlehem migrations and experiences. But Jubrail was probably the person that I felt I had the most interesting collection of sources relating to his movements. And the reason I start with that is because it just switched my mind into a different gear in terms of thinking about this guy Jubrail Dabdoub, because up to that point I very much considered him and his peers in terms of these young men. They were mainly young men in the mid to late 19th century, traveling the world as businessmen. And I'd always thought of them as quite, I suppose, rational economic agents who were, often very successful or effective as traders and brought back a lot of capital to Bethlehem itself. And suddenly we find him here in this miracle. And as I looked into the sources more, I realized that this was an event which he himself and his wider family seemed to very much believe to have been a supernatural divine intervention that brought him back from the dead. He was declared dead by the local priest from typhoid fever. And it just suddenly forced me to start thinking about these characters in a slightly different way, to think, well, actually, these are people deeply embedded in a view of spirituality and a view of local religion in an Arabo-Islamic context, which I probably hadn't been giving that much thought to. So my next challenge in a way was, okay, how do I write up this miracle and include it in this book project that I'm starting to put together about Bethlehem merchants? And I toyed around. I sort of dived into theories, particularly sociological and anthropological theories about miracles, about reciprocity, gift giving, patronage. I gave conference talks, and it sort of all made sense. It was quite a logical, rationalized way of explaining the miracle, that in a way these Bethlehem merchants acted as patrons of Marie Alphonsine and the order that she was part of. But I just found myself a little bit dissatisfied in the sense that I was very aware that I wasn't really giving much attention to the way in which the characters themselves clearly had perceived this event as some kind of divine or supernatural intervention had taken place, and not really giving that sufficient credence. So I became more interested in what anthropologists call the ontological turn, which is a way of saying that actually people inhabit very different sort of mental universes, and that we can't explain everything through one sort of singular set of symbols, one singular set of kind of cultural markers. And actually we accept fundamentally different mental universes, and that as scholars sometimes we need to go with that. And so I set about myself the task of writing up this miracle. And the more I did that, the more I thought, actually, why not turn this whole book actually into an exercise in thinking about different ways of writing history. So that was the starting point, really. Much further down the line, I ended up at this sort of, if you like, a toolkit that I developed through borrowing essentially from authors of magical realist fiction, which is a genre, as your listeners will be aware, of fiction which is especially associated with Latin America, but has really been picked up and used and and reimagined in various literary contexts around the world, particularly in the global south, I think, particularly where you have writers interested in this sometimes very arresting, traumatic dynamic where people are exposed quite rapidly, quite suddenly, to processes of colonialism, of global capital and capitalism, of industrial modernity, and the very arresting juxtapositions that can arise from that. And magical realist fiction is very good at capturing that. I certainly felt. I've been reading magical realist fiction for many years. And so with great trepidation, I started to try and write this narrative in that kind of style. I need to make clear to your listeners that I'm not claiming any literary merit here whatsoever. It's more of an experiment as a historian who's very much trained in a, let's say, realist form of writing, a certain way that we're trained through your education as historians and other social science, humanities subjects to write in a particular way. So I was trying to unlearn some of that stuff, but in a way, just what happens if we borrow some of the classic tropes of magical realist authors. And so that's how the kind of project unfolded from there, I guess.
I want to, with you, tell the listeners what the book is about. And so I was wondering if you can start with the general context, how Bethlehem looked like in the 19th century. And perhaps you can introduce also the Dabdoub family, and mentioning also the origin of the family name that for non-Arabic speakers, Dabdoub essentially means teddy bear.
There are lots of theories about the origins of the Dabdoub name, which I do not claim to have a definitive answer to. But there are theories about various family progenitors who had bear-like features, who stomped like a bear, or who were, in times of hardship, were stomping the ground, trying to find edible plants amongst the weeds. Various sort of idiosyncratic features. I don't think that one's one that I'm going to be able to resolve, I'm afraid. But I suppose that does raise a wider question about surnames, which I found quite interesting. And in the case of Bethlehem, I think this is common in many parts of the world, not just in Palestine. Surnames, there seems to be a very definite moment in the parish records, at least, when families start to take on surnames, particularly in the 1700s. We can speculate that this is this is linked to the need to distinguish yourself when you go further afield in terms of trade and other forms of social interaction. So previously, Bethlehemites, like in the people across the wider region, would just use their their nasab name, so Ibn such and such or bint such and such. So you might be Elias ibn Hanna, for example. But if you go to a town that is 20 miles away and there's another Elias ibn Hanna, how do you start to distinguish yourself, whether you're a merchant or whether you're thinking about other types of social economic interaction? So in Bethlehem, it seems very a very distinct moment where families start to. A lot of it is about tracing back your ancestry, which roots back through your ancestry do you trace? In the case of these Catholic families, like the Dabdoubs, are very keen to associate themselves in many cases with some forms of imagined European ancestry. I say imagined not in the sense that doesn't necessarily exist, but you can focus on one specific strand of your genealogy to the expense of others, right? And by emphasizing this one strand, you are making a kind of active decision, conscious or otherwise, to imagine your family history in a certain way. So that's certainly the case with the Catholic families. I'm digressing here. I think you asked me more generally, well, how does Bethlehem look at the start of the 19th century? I think you have essentially a large village which has long been connected to the outside world, primarily through pilgrimage. Bethlehem sits just 6 miles or so south of Jerusalem, obviously because of its biblical significance. It's long been a center for pilgrims of all sorts, Christians of many kinds, but also Muslims and Jews. There are many sites in the wider region that draw in those pilgrims. So Bethlehemites are quite used to having outsiders in their town, but at the same time, it seems relatively unusual for Bethlehemites to be traveling long distances, certainly in the up to the early to mid 19th century. But what they do have is a rapidly developing local artisanal trade in devotional objects, so what we might call Holy Land souvenirs. And Bethlehem becomes quite distinct in this sense for these goods that their local artisans produce. A lot of this is related to the particular history of intensive interactions with the Catholic world in Bethlehem. The Franciscan order has a sort of central role to play in this. The Franciscans were able to maintain their presence more or less continuously in Bethlehem after the Crusades, unlike other towns across the region where they weren't able to maintain their convent. And for various reasons, the Franciscans have much more success in Bethlehem than anywhere else in the wider region. And you have already by the 1700s, around half of Bethlehem's population, maybe even slightly more, is sort of at least formally registering themselves as Roman Catholics. These aren't Maronites or other kind of uniate churches which are loosely connected to the Catholic Church. These are out and out Roman Catholics who have a very direct relationship with the Franciscan community, the Franciscan convent in Bethlehem. And they produce certain types of goods which are designed for the Franciscans to sell to visiting pilgrims. And the Franciscans do very well out of this trade. They've for since at least the 1500s, they've been shipping them around to their benefactors and to various churches around Europe. The Franciscans have this very wide network of connections, of course. And the Bethlehemites have long played the role of these kind of subservient local producers, often coming into tension and conflict with their Franciscan masters, I guess we could say. But very interesting things happen in the 19th century. The town, for a series of reasons, largely connected to globalization, to the rise of steam travel, of communications, if it's becoming more affordable to travel long distances. The Bethlehemites start to take their products themselves to external markets. And this involves, again, a lot of tension with the Franciscans, but they manage to start bypassing the Franciscan community as a sort of middle stratum. And, it requires a lot of trial and error, some very, a lot of failures, especially in the early stages. But by the 1870s, you find that Bethlehem families are sending out young men, often aged as young as 16, 17, to various parts of Europe and then further afield to the Americas or even east to parts of South and Eastern Asia to trade in these goods, and often achieving great success. These are goods produced primarily from mother of pearl, partly through the Franciscans at least. The Bethlehemites have developed their very unique style of mother of pearl carving, which is at the high end, incredibly sophisticated, intricate works of art, some of the finest works of art, I would say, to come out of Palestine at any stage of history, in fact. And they use that as a sort of a stepping stone. If you turn up in a country, the Philippines, for example, was one of the countries they targeted in the 1880s. And for good reason. The Philippines is a Catholic country, right? Under Spanish colonial rule. And the Spanish are encouraging at that very time more open forms of trade and more liberal, quote unquote, liberal immigration policies. And so the Bethlehemites are quite savvy at tapping into that. And they find captive markets, people who never had the chance to travel to the Holy Land, but a sense of a sort of more visceral, physical contact through these objects. It allows the Bethlehemites to really prosper as merchants. And from there, they expand into all sorts of import-export businesses that eventually have very little to do with these devotional objects, but that's certainly the starting point. And as we move through the 19th century into the early 20th century, you find these kind of family business empires developing, which is bringing back large amounts of capital into Bethlehem. So the town's sort of social, urban fabric changes, new styles of architecture. The town expands beyond its cluster in the arranged, along the ridge of Bethlehem, where the Nativity Church is located. It expands outwards as these families build their new mansions and workshops. So it really radically alters the sort of physical and social fabric of Bethlehem. I know you asked me specifically about Jubrail's family and his parents. I don't know if you want me to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about his family. So the story of Jubrail Dabdoub, as you mentioned, is deeply intertwined with the one of the city of Bethlehem, and also with Sister Marie Alphonsine, but we will talk about her later. And I was wondering if you can start talking about Jubrail's father and mother, particularly Rosa, who is a key figure in the story.
Yeah, his Rosa Batarse was Jubrail's mother. She was born in 1826 and married at a very young age, at the age of 15, into the Dabdoub family. So these were two Catholic families from what's called the Tarajme quarter of Bethlehem, which is a group of Catholic families who historically had some kind of role as translators and interpreters. And her family in particular, the Batarse family, sort of prided itself on being probably closer than any family to the Franciscans. So they had quite an elevated status within the Bethlehem sort of local context. And you find these strategic marriages taking place as these families are just starting to build up their businesses in the 1850s and 60s, and even slightly prior to that. So Rosa is married into this into the Dabdoub family at a very young age. Her new husband, Yusuf Dabdoub, is clearly, we don't know so much about Yusuf, but clearly he was an ambitious young man who established one of the first kind of more professionalized workshops of mother of pearl in Bethlehem. And studying the parish records, I did some sort of statistical studies as well about the wider Dabdoub family. There's hundreds and hundreds of entries for the Dabdoubs from this period of the births, the marriages, etc., the baptisms. And I found that in that period, when just as the mother of pearl trade and the migration is really taking off, the number of children per family really expands. So it seems like the goal is almost to have as many children as possible and to produce as many sons as possible. Because as I mentioned earlier, these young sons are being sent off to travel the world and try and establish new trading bases for these families. And so Rosa, in many ways, her sort of story conforms to that. As I say, married at the age of 15. She has 8 children. Jubrail is, the 5th of those. She has 4 sons and 5 sons, 5 sons and 3 daughters. And in a way, it's easy to sort of leave her role there, because in terms of the travel and this overseas migration in the early stages, it was very much young men. But the more I looked into Rosa's story, the more it became apparent to me that clearly she and others like her were playing absolutely fundamental roles in the sort of maintenance of these family businesses, as bookkeepers, as purveyors of a new kind of sort of domestic modernity as well, in terms of the palaces that were built and how they were furnished. But also, as the men increasingly find themselves abroad, the women often do play the role of maintaining that family base back in Bethlehem. And Rosa seems to be a very strong character in this Dabdoub family history. And so I was sort of fascinated by her as a figure and her relationship to Jubrail, because, you know, true to form, her young sons, including Jubrail, at the age of 18, I think he makes his first overseas journey, are sent to, you know, this is very exciting, I guess, but also a period of great sort of trepidation, fear for the families, as these young boys essentially are sent out to distant corners of the world. And would they come back? And sometimes they didn't. The parish records are littered with examples of young men who are just recorded, often in Italian. The Catholic parish records will just say morto in America or morto in Argentina, or whatever it might be. So died in whatever country in Latin America or elsewhere, as news has sort of filtered back in quite a vague way. So it's quite a sort of arresting, traumatic time as well. So that's the story of Rosa.
I would like to start talking about the trips that you already mentioned. Some were successful, some were not. And for Jubrail, the first trip is actually to Paris. That didn't really turn out to be very successful on a personal basis. And I was wondering if you can give us a sense about the journeys and their missions of these young Bethlehemites, or even more experienced individuals. And also, if you can talk about the expanding network of Bethlehemites around the world, how they saw, for instance, America, and how did these new countries look like to them, whether the Philippines, whether America, or other, Latin American countries, for instance.
Yeah, that's something which is very hard to capture, actually, in sort of precise, let's say, empirical terms as a historian. As I said, there's a handful of works that I came across from the Dabdoub family and their wider network, which give us glimpses into this. But I think we're in a period where it's especially in many areas of the Ottoman Empire, I think people very, very visibly and very viscerally have a sense of living through times of great transformation. And almost that time itself is speeding up as these new forms of connections, of transportation, of communication come into play. It's a fascinating work that I came across by a scholar called Pauline Lewis, who's talking about the advent of the telegraph, for example, in the Ottoman Empire. She wrote a great PhD dissertation called Wired Ottomans. And amongst the sources that she used, she finds this Syriac gospel book from the town of Idil in today's southeastern Turkey. A gospel book where you normally get illustrations of saints' lives and miracles and sort of what we might think as more conventionally religious themes. And in this gospel book shows this amazing illustration of the telegraph line that connected Istanbul to Baghdad, with the wires depicted and the lines in the center of the picture, and how they sort of burrow deep into the houses of these two cities. And the text that accompanies that talks about this as a wonder, as a miracle, using that kind of terminology. So I think that's what most fascinated me, was the extent to which these very arresting forms of modern technology, modern capitalism, often in a very kind of colonial context, would have appeared to people from a place like Bethlehem, where people are, for the first time on a sort of collective level, stepping outside of a relatively local context. You know, it's one thing to have a pilgrim from Germany or from Iraq in your local church, praying in your local church, but it's another thing when it's your brother or your uncle or your cousin who has just come back from a long journey, and there's a much more of a sense of the immediacy and the proximity of that. So often what I try to do in the book is to almost recapture a scene when people are in the central square of Bethlehem, Baba Dir, the manger square as we call it, and imagine a traveller like Jubrail coming back from a place like the Philippines or the exhibition he went to in Chicago, for example, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, which he won a prize at along with his brothers for their display there. And the kind of reactions and the way in which those stories might have been told to a local population was probably eager to hear about these things, but also unsure what might have been embellished, what might be fact, what might be fiction, the blurred sort of lines between that. So often I try to retell the stories in that sense. So not necessarily making a claim that this is exactly what happened and this is exactly what Jubrail felt, but capture more sort of an attempt to capture an atmosphere, a prevailing sort of zeitgeist at the time of excitement and confusion and disorientation. But then at other stages, I've written passages on the ships themselves when Jubrail takes his first trip to Paris or to the Philippines as a young man in 1881, moving through locations for the first time as a young man, and how sort of bewildering that must have been. And so going back to the point about the magical realist approach that I adopted, one of the things that magical realist authors are famous for doing is inverting our expectations of what constitutes the ordinary and what constitutes the abnormal or the supernatural, and often describing the kind of technologies of modern capitalism in terms of miracles, of awe, of wonder, as well as in more, let's say, traumatic terms, but something that's essentially unnatural, something that's essentially strange, befuddling, bewildering, using that kind of language. Whereas in certain contexts, experiences of what we might think of as supernatural interventions can be are described by magical realist authors in a deliberately sort of deadpan way, as if the audience would have expected that to happen, and it's not really necessarily something particularly worth remarking on in any great sort of hyperbole. So I deliberately tried to do that in some of the descriptions, to invert those categories of the ordinary and the and the sort of paranormal. Yeah, thinking about Jubrail's very first journey, which you asked me about, his first sort of overseas journey, it was to Paris to attend one of the many sort of world's fairs or expositions that were held in Paris. This one was in 1878. So here I've hopefully made it clear in the endnotes, this isn't necessarily something that happened directly to Jubrail, but at that event, reading through the reports that were made by the organizers of the exhibition. This is the exhibition that's held on the Trocadero, so just opposite across the river from where the Eiffel Tower is today. Of course, the Eiffel Tower was built for a later exposition in 1889. But from the reports from the 1878 exhibition that I know Jubrail attended with his elder brothers, there's this fascinating story of some of the Bethlehemite traders who are kicked out because they have their own designated stall, and they're participating through the Ottoman section of the exhibition. And they have their designated stall, but what they start doing is subletting that stall to people from various other areas. Some remarks are made to sort of, I think, Syrian, Lebanese, but even possibly from further afield, who are kind of selling what are described as kind of counterfeits, Holy Land objects. And because this is something that wasn't, strictly forbidden at the exhibition, they were removed from the exhibition grounds because of this. So I sort of imagined, okay, maybe Jubrail himself was directly involved in that. Maybe he wasn't. And it's quite likely that he was part of that group, because there weren't that many Bethlehemites there. There were a couple of other families there. Perhaps they're all in on it together. We're not quite sure, actually. But just to then sort of imagine what that looked like and tell it through the eyes of Jubrail, going back to him being a kind of composite historical character. And that's just fascinating for me, because the Bethlehemites were very quickly mimicked by all sorts of other traders, hawkers, merchants, of various kind of peddlers. And these exhibitions are often a place where we find that happening. So at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition, 1876, the reports there talk about how there were people with Irish accents hawking Holy Land goods. So I think people very quickly realized, this is quite a lucrative trade, actually. We can try this ourselves. And the Bethlehemites have an interesting connection to that, sort of relationship to that. So the Paris exhibition, 1878, we find them realizing that can have some financial benefit, because we can sublet out to these people and give them our Holy Land sort of brand on our stall. But in probably more commonly, they're actually very keen, especially when they travel to new areas of the world and trying to set up shop there, to distinguish themselves. So we're the real thing. We're the real Bethlehemites from the real Holy Land. In most cases, we're talking about people from modern day Lebanon imitating them. And this is quite well documented. If you read the work of famous writers like Amin Rehani famously satirizes this. All of these sort of trinkets and counterfeit Holy Land goods that are actually being produced in factories in Marseille and New York primarily, but based on this Bethlehemite success model. So you find that the Bethlehemites play quite a crucial role in the wider history of the Arab diaspora, because this is the time in which people from across Ottoman Syria, today's Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, are established themselves in large numbers, particularly in the Americas. Huge Lebanese Syrian populations today in Argentina, Brazil, the US, Mexico, many other countries. And often it is the Bethlehemites that were the trailblazers, the first to go there, establish new sort of patterns of migration and trade, and have this mimicry of people in their wake, young men and women selling sort of fake Holy Land goods as an initial route into then doing other stuff. And the Bethlehemites were always trying to stay one step ahead of them and search out territories that the Lebanese hadn't yet got to. And this is one of the reasons why they seem to end up in Chile, which has the largest concentration of Palestinians in the Americas today, outside of the Middle East, anywhere in the world today, because it was across the Andes. It was harder to get to rather than places like Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, where the Lebanese were settling in large numbers. So it's a very sort of specific story that's unique to Bethlehem, but it also has these much bigger ramifications that reverberate across regional histories of migration and diaspora.
I'm curious about the concept of America. You talk about it in the book. So I was wondering, what is America, or America in general, for Bethlehemites and for travelers?
That's a very interesting question, Roberto. It's a term that I deliberately kept in its colloquial Arabic form in the book, America. Of course, in standard Arabic, it would be America, but a more commonly used local term in Bethlehem is America. And it comes to have a very sort of vague symbolic significance of being, so if this kind of peak period of Bethlehemite emigration, right at the end of the 19th century and the very beginning of the 20th century, it's almost a byword, it seems to be, for anywhere that's kind of overseas, anywhere that's across the waters. Possibly not Europe. I think there's a longer history of interaction. I think there's a clearer sense of, well, certain parts of Europe at least. As I've said, the Bethlehemites have this long history of close ties to the Catholic Church in Europe, especially the Franciscans. So through that, I think there's more of a familiarity, especially the term frangi, which I've used, which is derivative of Frank, or connected to the word the Franks from the sort of Crusader terminology, or Faranja in the plural of the colloquial term, which refers to Western Europeans, I suppose, not just to France by any means, but often it seems to be a byword for kind of Catholic Europe, Northern and Western Europe. So there is a history of that that sort of level of knowledge and familiarity. But as you go into this late 19th century period, suddenly people are traveling, I mean, I can't emphasize enough, really, to every corner of the world. And America seems to be the term that's used to capture that sense. It's sort of referring to the sense of the unknown, of potentially very lucrative trading opportunities, and a lot of exaggerated stories of streets being paved with gold and unbound opportunities there, and sort of encouraging these young men, and then later women too, to set off in search of their riches. I mean, literally every Bethlehem family by the 1890s has got some person who has set off to a sort of unknown, distant location in the world. So America comes to capture that. Famously, there are stories of people sort of saying, "Oh, my son is currently in trading in America," and the person asks him, "Which part of America then?" He says, "It's an island called Australia." So even areas like Australia could be conceived as being part of this kind of term America, which I think it refers to the idea of a new world, of a world of discovery, of trade, and it brings up the notion of these people being sort of there's an intersection with colonial histories there as well, which I think is quite interesting to think about. Above all, the word America comes about, or the concept of America comes about, because the majority of these migrations were headed across the Atlantic. not actually so much to North America in the case of Bethlehem, more to Central and South America. So broadly translated, we might say it's the Americas in that wider sense. But really, it's a symbolic term for an imagined overseas area of lucrative trade.
I want to move to talk about the other main character in the story, at least for part of the story. So let's talk now about Sister Marie Alphonsine. Who was she, and how does it relate to the story of Jubrail?
So Marie Alphonsine was from a Jerusalemite family, and she was born in the 1840s, so slightly, 15 years or so before Jubrail. But in many ways, their lives, she died slightly before Jubrail, but their lives sort of ran in parallel in that sense. But also very, very different, a very different type of historical character to these Bethlehemite merchants that I was tracing. So I was interested in how those two very different trajectories collided in this recorded miracle in 1909. From quite a young age, she showed herself to be very pious. She wanted to join the Sisters of St. Joseph, a French-run congregation in Jerusalem and operating in the wider area in Bethlehem as well, which she did. But then in the 1870s, she starts to have visions of the Virgin Mary in particular, a very sort of embodied experience of contact with the Virgin Mary. And quite a lot has been written on this subject about experiences of visions and the kind of gendered nature of that. The Virgin Mary representing quite sort of complex mixture of both sort of patriarchal forms of disciplining women in certain roles, but also allowing spaces for that to be reimagined and recapturing, I suppose, local women's agency through that process. But through these visions of the Virgin Mary, she has very extremely powerful visions that leave her completely exhausted for days afterwards. There is a level of sort of physical intimacy that almost borders on the sexual in these encounters, which is an interesting area to explore. Akram Khater has written about this in his tale of an 18th century nun in Lebanon, really interestingly. But in the case of Marie Alphonsine, she starts receiving instructions from the Virgin Mary to establish her own congregation based on prayer of the Rosary, of the Catholic Rosary, but very specifically to establish a locally run congregation that will specifically serve local Arab women, particularly in the fields of kind of education, and to reach the sort of poorest, most neglected areas of society. So going back to that kind of dual nature of the Virgin Mary and her potential, how we read that, it really sort of highlights that, because here we have a woman who's schooled in the Catholic Church and is part of a French order, the Sisters of St. Joseph, and through the Virgin Mary is now being compelled to set up a very locally based, explicitly Arab new religious order. And she meets a lot of opposition within the Sisters of St. Joseph when she starts to confide in a local priest, a local Jerusalemite Arabic-speaking priest, who ends up being her sort of supporter within this, but a big rift breaks out within the local community of the Sisters of St. Joseph, even requires intervention from the Vatican to resolve this dispute. After being exiled for a while, she's eventually able to establish this new order, but it's never revealed that she is the driving force behind it. Rather, it's this priest who she confides in, Yusuf Tanous, who is sort of public founder of the order, and she goes on to work tirelessly with this order for the rest of her life in the local area, as well as across the Jordan River in Assault, where she works with very poor communities there who are nominally Catholic due to sort of long ago processes of conversion, but in the eyes of at least sort of Orthodox Catholicism have strayed very far from what is considered to be the true Catholic path. So some very interesting kind of encounters with local women there. And she writes these really amazing memoirs and notebooks from her time with the Rosary Sisters, which are still preserved today at the Rosary Sisters sort of headquarters in Beit Hanina, just outside Jerusalem. Fascinating historical source. And amongst her notebooks are descriptions of the many miracles that she performed, including the salvation or the resurrection of Jubrail Dabdoub, which has a sort of a one-page description. Very matter-of-fact terms. She doesn't actually use the term miracle there. But going back to my earlier points, this is a very just a fascinating source for me to look at and to put alongside these kind of histories of commercial trading of these Bethlehem merchants and see how these worlds very much collided. She had been living in Bethlehem with the Rosary Sisters for a few years before that miracle took place with Jubrail, and had already gained a reputation as an almost sort of mystic, or a woman with great healing powers. She had healed blind people. She had pulled children out of wells. She had expelled snakes. She had done all sorts of carried out all sorts of miraculous acts. And Jubrail was sort of the latest, actually the last in a long line of these miracles which she was held to have performed. I was just super interested in how her life could collide with that of Jubrail's. Jubrail had traveled the world, had lived in the Philippines, in Central America, in France, in the US. Here was a woman who from a very young age was forbidden by her father to leave Palestine, and had devoted herself to a life of poverty, and embraced that poverty, actually. So in terms of the values, her connectedness to a very rudimentary style of living, in contrast to the Bethlehemite merchants and their quest for wealth and their display of that wealth, actually, in a lot of the houses and projects which they sponsored in Bethlehem. So in so many ways, this was opposites colliding. And yet I increasingly didn't sort of realize I had to collapse some of those, the idea that these were binary categories, that actually for the Bethlehemite merchants, people like Jubrail, piety, being from Bethlehem, and the religious significance of that was absolutely central to who they are. And as their business success was so often attributed in their writings, the letters that they wrote, the language that they used, it was intrinsic to that was their sense of faith and the protection of saints, and the Virgin Mary in particular as a local, think about the figure of Mary and her significance to Bethlehem above all places. This was really central to how they attributed the smooth running of their business affairs. So it just opened up a new kind of angle of vision for me.
I have a few questions left, and one actually is connected to the question of business affairs in Bethlehem as a developing city. So Jubrail and other Bethlehemites family became very wealthy, obviously, during this period of time. And this was mirrored in the city through its urban structure and obviously growth in population. And I was wondering, how did Bethlehem change in light of the expanding world trade of sacred objects? And also if there's any connection with the religious aspects of, the miracles, for instance, performed by Maria Alphonsine, and, whether she was part of the story of increasing sort of the, let's call it, value of Bethlehem.
Yeah, I think the Bethlehemite merchants really needed figures like Marie Alphonsine, not just her. There were many other. This was a period of, that's one of the things that really interested me. I think there was a fervor in Bethlehem at this time that they were living through almost like an age of miracles. My initial working title for the book actually was Bethlehem in the Age of Miracles. I thought that might distract people into sort of a biblical theme that the book really wasn't about. But a sense that unprecedented times were happening, on almost limitless possibilities. If you're living in a town really a village, which has been restricted to a semi-rural way of life, families still largely reliant upon subsistence agriculture for many centuries, and people largely sort of spatially remaining in one place. And then a sudden explosion of movement, of capital coming into the town, of new clubs and societies, some new political currents, new cultural ideas, sort of societal changes happening very rapidly as these influences are coming into the town. But like I said, I don't think that's easily separated from a belief in the intervention of saints, a belief in the sort of spiritual significance of Bethlehem as the birthplace of Jesus. All of these things, I think, intertwine to have makes us think more broadly about what do we mean by miracle, and what did people at the time think of as miracles? What constitutes a miracle? An economic miracle, a religious miracle, a social miracle, a political miracle. So all of these things seem to be sort of thrown into this this melting pot in Bethlehem at that time. And I think figures like Marie Alphonsine were very important to that, for the Bethlehem merchants to show that this wasn't just about making as much money as you possibly could. They were very keen to sort of sponsor certain new public building projects in Bethlehem. If you go to the Milk Grotto shrine today in Bethlehem, for example, this was directly sponsored by families, particularly the Katan family, which had whose inscription is still above the shrine there today, which dates from the 1870s and 80s, and various other kind of monuments around the town within the church itself as well. So an idea that you're investing in your hometown, and as a way of showing your rootedness, of showing your piety, and as a sort of explanatory mechanism, I suppose, for the accumulation of large amounts of capital as well. And that also provokes a lot of anxiety amongst the Bethlehem families, particularly amongst men. So a lot of the story is about a kind of masculine anxiety. What happens when eventually women start to also join in this process of overseas migration? Jubrail's generation, it was largely young men, but that's not really sustainable. A drop-off in number of children per family starts to happen by the 1880s, 1890s. Jubrail, when he's in his 20s and 30s, he himself only has 3 children compared to his parents' 8 children, and his children are massively spaced out by a 10-year gap in one case between 2 of his children. And clearly that's because he's not in the town for most of the time. He's rarely in Bethlehem. He goes away for sometimes years at a time. Again, opening this question of women being actually the people who keep things running back in Bethlehem itself. So that's not really sustainable. It's almost a system. It's quite patriarchal business model that develops these family firms sending out young men. It contains within it the seeds of its own downfall, because eventually, to keep producing children and sustaining families, because family sits at the heart of so much of this, Bethlehemites start, if, for example, Bethlehemites based in, let's say, Central America, will come back to Bethlehem to find a bride. Again, the age of women's marriage seems to be coming down and down in the late 19th century. So brides of sometimes 13, 14 years old are being sent off to the other side of the world to marry a young man who has opened a shop there as a branch of his family's business. And this anxiety, okay, what happens when we start allowing young women, young girls to be exposed to what we're often seen as the moral depravities of America, this term that we were discussing. So in terms of the sort of effect on society's moral fiber as they're exposed to greater mixing of the sexes, different types of cultural norms, but also the family's ability to be rooted in Bethlehem itself. If you are now having children on the other side of the world, as it is increasingly the case by the turn of the 20th century, how do you maintain that base back in Bethlehem itself as the older generation starts to die out? And I think this was one of Jubrail's really key concerns. And he watched people, his children and his nephews and nieces, start to, successively, one by one, leave Bethlehem and set up permanently, whether it's in Paris, whether it's in El Salvador, in Bolivia, in various countries in the Americas. Suddenly you're losing your base in Bethlehem, which was the very sort of sat at the heart of your whole identity as a family business. We're from Bethlehem, and the sense of religious significance, piety, and social status that went with that. So it's also a story of those ties being loosened, and women in particular starting to sort of increasingly be able to impose themselves on those patterns.
How do the stories of Jubrail and Sister Marie Alphonsine end? And also, what happened to Bethlehem in the long term?
So in the case of Jubrail, it's a sad end to his life. We think he's died once in 1909, but he's resurrected by Marie Alphonsine. And then he eventually dies in 1931, which is a time, it's a poignant moment for that's really where the book ends as well. Because the Bethlehem businesses have gone into a massive crisis, due primarily to the Great Depression. The countries where they're most heavily invested, particularly Chile, to a lesser extent, Bolivia, Mexico, the United States, of course, France was a huge area of investment for these families. These are some of the hardest struck countries by the great crash of 1929 and the reverberations of that through 1930-31. So you see sort of almost one by one the Bethlehem families going bankrupt in this period, including Jubrail's family. And there are some surviving letters actually which Jubrail himself penned, where he's desperately trying to bring in his creditors who owe the family money, so that these businesses would work on credit. As they became more and more successful, they would give large amounts of produce to relatives, to smaller businesses wishing to start up in various areas of the Americas. And suddenly they were owed massive amounts of money at the very time that their businesses were folding. So he's desperately trying to bring in his creditors without much success. And so he dies with the family going bankrupt. And this is a sort of well-known story in Bethlehem today. Some of the most famous Bethlehem merchant families, the Dabdoubs, the Jasir family, notoriously were left penniless by the early 1930s. Many of them later recovered and found ways to revive their businesses. But at the time of his death, that was the great sort of series of events that were unfolding. So it's a sad end, but also seemed to me in some ways a suitable way to finish that story, almost a kind of a rise and a fall. And however the Bethlehemites managed to recover or readapt through the 1940s and beyond, it would never quite be the same again. There's the political context of the British Mandate coming to an end and the establishment of the State of Israel, and the very negative consequences of that for trade for these Bethlehem families. And so this seemed like going back to this idea of the age of miracles, that somehow that had been shut down. And several of the older generation that I interviewed of Bethlehemites, who were certainly not Jubrail's age, but say his grandchildren, or even in some cases children's generation, were very adamant that you don't get miracles like that happening anymore. The ones such as the resurrection of Jubrail himself, those things don't happen in Bethlehem these days. This time of miracles has passed, and I found that really interesting. That these days Bethlehem is locked into a much more kind of harsh reality, where the possibilities seem to be much more restricted. So that's I don't want to take away the various remarkable ways that Bethlehemites continue to resist the conditions that they find themselves in. And the Dabdoub family, just to take one example, is spread out all over the world and often have been remarkably successful as artists, as writers, as people of business, and in many different fields. So it's incredible, really, the adaptability of these families on a kind of global scale. And within Bethlehem itself, ongoing forms of eking out a living, but also of finding creativity and beauty within a very difficult set of circumstances. I don't want to detract from that, but it seemed like a very different age, this sort of pre-1940s age, and Jubrail's death seems to coincide with that. Marie Alphonsine has the nun who saved his life. She died in 1927. She retired to Ein Kerem, and lived out sort of the final stages of her notebooks seem to depict her living in kind of tranquil retirement there before she died. When she died, a great controversy broke out amongst the sisters amongst the Rosary Sisters, this congregation that she founded, and it revolved around her role in setting up that congregation in the first place, because she had to set it up in secret. Her visions could not be more broadly known because it would have been too controversial for a woman explicitly advocating for kind of Arab salvation and Arab community work. They had to do it all through this male priest who I mentioned earlier, who was officially the founder of the congregation. And when her notebooks were discovered upon her death, this kind of rival faction within the Rosary Sisters burnt the notebooks as a way to destroy evidence of Marie Alfonsine's role in establishing the congregation. Luckily, however, Marie Alfonsine's sister and supporters of Marie Alfonsine had kept some copies which had been transcribed. So the story does eventually come to light, but these tensions within the congregation, within the order, I think reflect these wider contestations over local agency within sort of Catholic missions, and the specifically kind of gendered aspect of that.
I have one last question. I'm a huge fan of TV series, and recently, watching, like probably many millions around the world, The Last of Us or 1923. I was wondering if you ever thought, while writing the book, that perhaps the stories of Jubrail and Marie Alfonsine can actually fit the models of this current, TV series, and perhaps could be a good remedy and a balance against the success of a TV series like Fauda.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Fauda. I have to say, I probably shouldn't even admit that I've watched it, but I think it's problematic on many levels. Just get that one out there. Yeah, it does have a sort of cinematic quality to it, I think, Jubrail's tale and the miracle especially. I think there's a chapter devoted to the miracle where I was trying to just imagine that playing out in real time and going back to this sort of magical realist ethos, assume that there really was, follow the logic or follow the belief system, I suppose, of the characters involved, and assume that some kind of divine intervention takes place and that the Virgin Mary plays an integral role within that. So I tried to write that out in a I suppose quite visual way. So I definitely had that in my mind, that as bad as my writing is, as a sort of an attempt to kind of, in that particular chapter, to capture something quite cinematic. So I would be, if there's script writers out there, I'd be absolutely delighted to hear their ideas. I'm very keen to see this move in different directions. And on a wider level, I think that's what I've become quite interested in, these so many different ways in which we can tell stories about history, in which we can narrate history. And there's no reason why, and lots of academic historians do get involved with script writing projects, with theatre, with art, with the visual arts. There's so many different ways that we can think about capturing history. In my case, I guess I was more interested in the writing style of things. How can prose, or how can experimentation with a different form of prose, it isn't just that sort of realist prose that we're used to writing in academic history, how can that actually perhaps allow us access into meaning, right? Into extracting, understanding meaning from historical events through the writing itself. I was really inspired by Walter Benjamin in this, the German Jewish philosopher of the early 20th century, who had this idea of montage in his unfinished work called the Arcades Project, where his idea was to sort of capture the experience of 20th century modernity, and particularly kind of mechanized modernity, not by writing continual prose with constant analysis and explanation, but sort of flashpoints or snapshots, almost like a film reel unfolding. That was Walter Benjamin's idea. And I think there are lots of historians out there doing really interesting stuff with that in terms of how we write. That's what most kind of interested me, and hopefully in some small way this book is a contribution to that.
This was Jacob Norris, author of The Lives and Deaths of Jubrail Dabdoub, or How the Bethlehemites Discovered America, published by Stanford University Press in 2023. Jacob, thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto. Great pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.